The office lights were still burning when my phone vibrated in my hand. It was nearly 1 in the morning, and the glass walls of my executive suite reflected a man who looked successful, but felt completely hollow. Outside, Chicago pulsed with life, neon lights flickering like restless thoughts I could not silence. Inside, everything was quiet. Too quiet. I hesitated before answering the call. Somewhere deep inside, I already knew that nothing would ever be the same. When my uncle spoke, his voice cracked with a weight I had feared for months. My father was gone. Robert Thompson, the man who had worked himself to exhaustion so his sons could dream bigger than a small Ohio town, had taken his final breath. For a moment, I could not speak. The words echoed in my head, refusing to settle into reality. My father was gone, and I was hundreds of miles away, buried under deadlines and board meetings. I sank into my chair, gripping the edge of my desk as if it could hold me together. Memories rushed in without warning. My father teaching me how to hold a wrench. His laughter during simple dinners. The way his hands trembled slightly during our last phone call. I had promised to visit soon. Soon had never come. I wiped my face and did what 8 years in corporate leadership had trained me to do. I composed myself. I called my father-in-law, Victor Lang, the chairman of Lang Enterprises and the man who effectively controlled my life. I asked for 4 days. Just 4 days to attend my father's funeral and stand beside my brother. The silence on the line stretched painfully long. Then Victor sighed, as if my grief were an inconvenience. He told me the company was in a critical phase. He told me I was irreplaceable. He told me to set personal matters aside. Even my father's funeral, he said, was no exception. His words hit harder than I expected. I tried to explain. I lowered my voice, asking again, reasoning again. But his answer did not change. Responsibility to the corporation came first. Always, when the call ended, my hand was still shaking. I stared around the office. The polished desk. The endless files. The awards on the wall. This place had once felt like proof that my sacrifices were worth it. Now it felt like a prison built from my own ambition. Desperate for comfort, I called my wife, Sophia. She answered from a tropical resort, her voice light and distant, music and laughter echoing behind her. When I told her about my father, there was a pause, not of sorrow, but of indifference. She refused to speak to her father on my behalf. She told me not to complicate things. She told me to stay in Chicago. Her words cut deeper than Victor's. She was my wife, yet she sounded like a stranger defending a corporation, instead of a grieving husband. When she ended the call, the truth settled heavily in my chest. I was alone. An hour later, Human Resources confirmed Victor's decision. If I left without approval, I would face demotion or termination. 8 years of loyalty reduced to a warning. 8 years of sacrifice weighed against 4 days of humanity. I leaned back in my chair, exhaustion flooding my body. My mind drifted backward through the years. Late nights. Missed holidays. Cancelled visits home. Every time my father said he understood. Every time I chose work over family, believing I was securing a better future. 2 years earlier, when my father had suffered a serious health scare, I had stayed in Chicago because Victor insisted I was needed for a meeting. My brother had sat by my father's bedside while I reviewed contracts and spreadsheets. My father had told me it was fine. He always said it was fine. Now he was gone. Something inside me cracked. Not loudly, but completely. I realized that if I stayed, I would lose something far more valuable than a career. I would lose myself. With trembling fingers, I opened my laptop and typed my resignation. No anger. No explanations. Just the truth. I sent it before fear could stop me. I packed my belongings quietly and walked out of the building. The cold Chicago air hit my face as I stepped into the night, and for the first time in years, I felt strangely free. My phone buzzed constantly as I drove to the airport. Calls from Victor. Messages from Sophia. I did not answer. At home, I packed a small bag and held my father's old watch in my hand. It felt heavier than it should have. As the plane lifted off, tears streamed down my face. I whispered an apology to a man who had given me everything and asked for so little. I promised myself that I would never make the same mistake again. When I landed in Ohio, the sky was just beginning to lighten. The town looked smaller than I remembered, but warmer. At the church, my brother Ethan stood waiting. We embraced without words, grief finally allowed to surface. I had come home too late, but I had come home. That was the moment my life truly began again. The house felt unusually quiet after the funeral. My father's tools still hung neatly in the garage, exactly where he had left them. The scent of oil and metal lingered in the air, and for a moment, I imagined him walking in, wiping his hands on an old rag, asking if Ethan and I had eaten yet. But reality settled quickly. He was gone, and the silence he left behind was heavier than any grief I had ever known. Ethan and I sat at the small kitchen table that night, sharing a simple meal just like we used to when we were kids. No one spoke at first. Words felt unnecessary, maybe even dangerous. Eventually, I told him everything. I told him about the denied leave, the threats, my resignation, and the marriage that had felt more like a transaction than a partnership. Ethan listened carefully, his jaw tightening with every detail. When I finished, he leaned back and took a deep breath before saying something that stunned me. Lang Enterprises was under investigation. As a prosecutor, Ethan had been quietly working on a case involving corporate misconduct. Irregular financial records. Hidden transactions. Exploitation masked as efficiency. They suspected wrongdoing, but they lacked concrete internal proof. When he looked at me and said they needed someone on the inside, my chest tightened, fear rose immediately. I had just escaped that world. The thought of returning made my stomach churn. But then I thought of my father. A man who had lived honestly, worked tirelessly, and never once compromised his values. I realized that walking away was only half the journey. The other half was standing up. I told Ethan I would do it. Returning to Chicago felt like stepping back into a storm I had barely survived. The glass tower loomed over me again, cold and imposing. Victor welcomed me back with thinly veiled anger, accusing me of betrayal, but needing my expertise too much to turn me away. Sophia barely looked at me. I slept on the couch and spoke only when necessary. Every day, I wore my old mask. Calm. Efficient. Obedient. But inside, I was different. I quietly gathered documents, copied emails, and noted patterns I had once ignored out of fear. Late at night, my heart racing, I sent files to Ethan. Each message felt like reclaiming a piece of my soul. Months passed. The pressure was intense. Victor grew more volatile. Sophia more distant. But I stayed focused. This was not revenge. This was accountability. Then one morning, everything changed. Federal investigators entered the building, calm, but unmistakably firm. Offices were searched. Computers seized. Executives questioned. The empire that had once seemed untouchable began to unravel before my eyes. The news spread quickly. Headlines followed. Court proceedings revealed what I had long suspected, but never dared to confront. The truth had finally surfaced. When Victor confronted me later, his voice shaking with rage, I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I simply told him that power built on control and disregard eventually collapses. He stormed away, defeated by his own choices. I filed my final resignation and divorce papers the same day. Walking out of that building for the last time, I felt no triumph, only peace. With the inheritance my father left us and the experience I had gained, I started something new. Thomson Logistics. A company built on fairness, transparency, and respect. I hired people who had once been overlooked. I treated them like humans, not resources. Growth came slowly at first, then steadily. Clients noticed the difference. They stayed because we delivered not just results, but trust. The company expanded, but my life stayed balanced. I visited Ethan often. I returned to Ohio regularly. I honored my father by living the values he had taught me. Years later, standing at his grave, I no longer felt regret. I felt gratitude. His lessons had guided me back when I was lost. Losing him broke me, but it also saved me. I finally understood that success is meaningless if it costs your humanity. That family is not defined by titles or contracts, but by loyalty and love. And that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it.